Supreme Court had gone the other way, I just can't imagine what the outcry would have been. That would have been something else.
Owning guns. I mean, this is a major Second Amendment ruling about who can and cannot potentially own a firearm. So here, a big win.
You see an 8-1 decision here that says it is okay, guns out of the hands of people.
There has been a broad interpretation of the Second Amendment coming from the High Court in recent years, but my goodness, that sounds like a common sense to a lot of Americans out there.
NRA's hypocrisy on arm control. The debate over arm control in the U.S. is a deeply polarized and contentious issue, often pitting advocates for arm rights against proponents of stricter regulations. Central to this debate is the interpretation of the Second Amendment, which states, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The phrase well-regulated militia has been subject to varying interpretations, with some arguing that regulated historically meant well-trained rather than subject to governmental oversight. Arm rights advocates, including powerful organizations like the National Rifle Association, typically oppose any form of arm control. They argue that the Second Amendment protects individual rights to own arms without interference. However, this stance often appears contradictory, especially when considering the strict security measures implemented at NRA conventions. For example, arms and related items are frequently banned at these events to ensure safety, which underscores the inherent risks associated with arm ownership and challenges the organization's broader public stance against arm control. Public opinion on arm control is sharply divided among demographic and political lines. Historically, arm control measures have often gained more acceptance when aimed at marginalized groups arming themselves. This selective application highlights underlying racial and class biases in the implementation and support of arm regulations. A conversation with an arm rights advocate reveals the complexities of these beliefs. When asked about potential regulations on arms, the individual asserts that the Constitution's mention of a well-regulated militia refers to well-trained individuals rather than regulatory laws. They acknowledge that not all Americans with arms are well-trained, but resist any changes to the Second Amendment, even if such changes could statistically save children's lives. This unwavering stance illustrates the deeply held convictions among arm rights supporters, who prioritize constitutional principles over practical considerations for public safety. This inconsistency becomes starkly evident in the context of NRA conventions, where the organization mandates disarmament to prevent potential violence, especially when high-profile figures like former President Donald Trump are present. The heightened security measures, including the use of magnetometers and explosive detection dogs, reveal an implicit acknowledgement of the dangers posed by arms. Yet these same advocates resist similar measures for the general public, particularly in vulnerable settings like schools. The security breaches at such events highlight the double standards in play. While third graders may not be deemed worthy of stringent protective measures, the safety of political leaders is given paramount importance. This hypocrisy is further illustrated by the requirement for attendees at NRA and Turning Point USA events to disarm, contradicting their own rhetoric about the efficacy of a good guy with an arm in preventing violence. Despite these contradictions, some individuals within the arm rights community express support for certain regulations. For instance, a Texan arm owner and Democratic lawmaker openly acknowledges owning arms and being licensed to carry, emphasizing that regulations did not impede their ability to own an arm. This perspective suggests that common sense regulations, such as background checks and training requirements, could be compatible with arm ownership rights. The debate over the role of the ATF also underscores the division. While some politicians call for the ATF to run amok to enforce existing laws more vigorously, others argue that increased regulation infringes on personal freedoms. The lack of consensus on what constitutes common sense regulations further complicates efforts to find middle ground. In the broader context, historical and cultural factors heavily influence the arm control debate in the U.S. The nation's frontier history, the mythos of the self-reliant individual, and the entrenchment of arm culture all play significant roles. Additionally, racial and socioeconomic factors contribute to differing perceptions and support for arm control measures. Unintended and foreseeable consequences. The debate over arm rights and arm control in the United States is deeply polarized, with strong arguments on both sides. The Second Amendment of the Constitution is often cited by arm rights advocates as a fundamental protection of individual liberties. However, this discussion also involves critical considerations of public safety and the regulation of arms. In legislative contexts, it is crucial for lawmakers to consider the unintended consequences of the laws they enact. However, in the case of arm regulations, many argue that both unintended and foreseeable consequences have been ignored. This negligence has led to repeated tragedies, prompting calls for more stringent regulations on arms from one side of the political aisle. A common argument from arm rights advocates is that proper training from a young age can mitigate the dangers associated with arms. They believe that children should be taught how to handle arms safely and responsibly. However, they also express frustration that current laws often prevent children from accessing arms until they're 18, by which time they may have been exposed to negative influences such as drugs and violent media. Many arm owners emphasize their right to self-defense and the need to protect themselves and their families from potential threats. They argue that law-abiding citizens should not be deprived of their rights due to the actions of criminals. This perspective is often rooted in personal experiences with arms and a belief in the importance of being prepared for self-defense situations, such as an active shooter scenario in a school. The discussion around arm regulations often includes debates about specific measures such as raising the legal age for arm ownership, implementing background checks, and banning certain types of arms like attack weapons. However, there is considerable confusion and disagreement over what constitutes an attack weapon. For example, some arm owners do not see their AR-15s as attack weapons, viewing them instead as versatile tools for hunting and home defense. The challenge for policymakers is to strike a balance between protecting individual rights and ensuring public safety. While many arm owners advocate for minimal restrictions, there is a growing call for common-sense regulations that could potentially save lives. These regulations might include mandatory training, comprehensive background checks, and limitations on certain types of arms. Purpose and use of arms. One of the central arguments made by proponents of arm ownership, particularly of so-called attack weapons, is their intended purpose for self-defense, rather than hunting or recreational shooting. Advocates assert that these arms are primarily tools for protecting oneself and one's family in the event of a home invasion or other threats. They argue that while hunting and recreational shooting are valid uses, the core function of arms like AR-15s lies in personal defense scenarios. The historical context of arm ownership in the U.S. is marked by a deep-seated cultural attachment to arms as symbols of personal liberty and protection against tyranny. This perspective is often rooted in events such as the American Revolution, where armed militias played a crucial role in securing independence from colonial rule. Over time, arms have become ingrained in American culture, celebrated as instruments of individual rights and defense. Historically, marginalized communities, such as African Americans and other minority groups, have utilized arms as a means of self-defense and empowerment in the face of systemic oppression and violence. For example, during the Civil Rights era, the Black Panthers' armed patrols aimed to protect their communities from police brutality and racial violence. This history underscores how perceptions of arm ownership can vary based on race, with actions by marginalized groups often met with harsher responses compared to predominantly white militias. Legislation around arms has evolved in response to public safety concerns and political pressures. The Mulford Act of 1967 in California, signed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, illustrates how perceptions of arm ownership can shift based on who is exercising their Second Amendment rights. The act, which restricted the public carrying of loaded arms, was a direct response to Black Panther activism, demonstrating a double standard in how armed activism is perceived and regulated. Critics of unrestricted arm ownership argue that Second Amendment absolutism, which opposes any form of arm control, is often selective in its application. They contend that while constitutional rights are upheld for certain groups, such as conservative militias, marginalized communities advocating for similar rights are met with resistance and stricter regulations. This discrepancy highlights broader societal attitudes towards arm ownership and the underlying biases that influence legislative responses. In contemporary debates, proposals for stricter arm control measures, including background checks, restrictions on high-capacity mags, and bans on attack weapons, aim to mitigate armed violence and enhance public safety. Proponents argue that such measures are necessary to prevent mass shootings and reduce arm-related deaths. However, opponents argue that these restrictions infringe upon individual rights and fail to address underlying societal issues contributing to violence. The debate over arms in the U.S. reflects deep-seated divisions over constitutional rights, cultural values, and public safety. While advocates of arm rights emphasize self-defense and individual liberty, critics highlight the need for responsible regulation to prevent armed violence. The historical context of arm ownership, legislative responses, and cultural perceptions all shape this contentious issue, underscoring the complex interplay between constitutional freedoms and societal responsibilities in the realm of arms policy. Finding a balance that respects both rights and safety remains a persistent challenge for policymakers and society at large. That's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time.